Hello, good morning. Just wondering if I think the streaming is good. Hi. If you are in the session, if you could say hi, just so I know that there are people there. I can't see. Um, oh, hi, Trent. I can't see the analytics, which is weird, but never mind. All right, we're gonna start on a little bit of a recap, a quick recap, really. Um, I'm gonna try as best as I can to try and finish chapter 4, so that on Monday we will be able. Hi, Taryn. Um, I am going to start on chapter 5, which is government intervention, on Tuesday. So, all right, let's start. We talked about aggregation of demand and supply um, last week. We talked about how our individual supplies added together will give you your aggregate supply. Here in this example, we sum the supply curves horizontally, but of course, if you have billions of demand curves or billions of supply curves or billions of suppliers or billions of consumers, then of course you will have to add them all together, which will give you an aggregate supply. Similarly, we're going to sum up all the demand curves horizontally, and we're going to add all our consumers together and all the quantity demanded at a particular price, and we're going to um, generate a aggregate demand curve. So all that aggregate demand and supply is the horizontal sum of the individual demand or supply curves. That's all it is. Nothing too complex. Now, remember, we are going to talk about market equilibrium, but we talked about market equilibrium, past tense, but we also talked about a world where we are in a perfectly competitive market, and a perfectly competitive market has 6 characteristics. We only mention about it being a price taker and not a price maker. But remember, a perfectly competitive market is a market where there are a large number of buyers and sellers. A perfectly competitive market is also selling a homogeneous product, which means that the product sold by all the sellers are the same. There are no barriers to entry or exit, and as a result, there is free entry and free exit. It's very easy to enter the market and very easy to exit the market. Buyers and sellers have complete knowledge. They have perfect information. There are no transaction costs, and they have perfect mobility of resources. So one of the key things that we mentioned last lecture with regards to market equilibrium is we plot the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve for the market and where it is at equilibrium, which is where the blue line is, or I'm going to put a pink dot here, where it is at equilibrium. We find the point of price, and we find our quantity demanded and quantity supplied at a particular price, and that is stable because at equilibrium there's no incentive for the price to change. We then also talked about what is excess supply and what is excess demand. And we looked at a graph and we say, okay, we are at the point 80 cents. Your quantity demand equals quantity supply at this particular point. And so that is equilibrium point where quantity demand equals quantity supply at 2 and we are selling at 80 cents. Now, if the for some reason the suppliers do not like the price of 80 cents and they want to propose a price of $2, so we go up to our $2 mark there. We draw a line across. I know the color isn't too different. Maybe I'll use a purple. Draw a line across, and when it hits the supply curve, we find our quantity supplied. When it hits the demand curve, we find our quantity demanded. And we talked about the difference between those dots as being excess supply. The reverse is true. I don't know whether I actually mentioned that. So if we happen to drop our price to 20 cents, of course, at this point, this is this dot, this is the supply curve. So this would be quantity supplied. And at this point, this will be quantity demanded. So at this particular point, your quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. And so we call this difference excess demand. Sorry, just trying to figure out whether I have missed anything. So when we looked at this, we said excess supply depicts a situation where the quantity supplied is larger than quantity demanded, and excess demand depicts a situation where quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. Okay, now, so we've talked about the difference between excess supply and excess demand. Now, the equilibrium price and quantity represents the price where quantity supply equals quantity demanded. So when we were looking at it before, that 80 cents is our equilibrium price. And did we have a quantity? $2. Quantity of 2 is our quantity supplied. So that is 2. All right, let's look at the next slide. Oh, yes. And then we talked about, looking at it from a vertical point of view. We talked about what is the reservation price for the seller, what is the reservation price for the buyer, and we look at the keenness to buy. Now, that was, if you remember, that was a really, really long example. So all I'm going to do today is in the recap, I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the key definitions, and then we'll move on from there and use this concept to take it forward. Okay, so we're going to say that the reservation price of a buyer is the highest price, so maximum price, the buyer is willing to pay for a given good. The reservation price for a seller is the lowest price, which is the minimum price the seller is willing to accept for a given good. So the term reservation price for either the buyer or the seller is a very key concept here. Now, see this really messy looking diagram. I'm not going anywhere near that diagram because it would be highly impossible for you to see what has gone on because there's so much on that graph. But what I am going to talk about is the rationing rule and the um, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and that will literally take us nicely towards the rest of the chapter. Now, okay, if you remember in this particular scenario that I gave you, seller one ended up selling to buyer three at $3. Seller three ended up selling to buyer two at $3. And seller two ended up selling to buyer one at $3. And $3 became the market price, where quantity demanded will equal quantity supply. And in a perfectly competitive market, we say that they are equilibrium price takers. Now, let's have a think and look back at what we talked about the rationing rule. The rationing rule states that buyers who value a good more will be the first to buy. Now, this is a really good concept because what it says is that people with the highest reservation price or the highest willingness to buy will be the first to act. So, for example, when we look back at seller, buyer one and seller one, buyer one has the highest reservation price, so they have the highest willingness to pay or to buy the good. And seller one has the lowest reservation price, and they are very keen to sell, and they are very keen to sell at a low price of $1. Now, these people will be the ones to trade first. The assumption makes sense because if you really want a particular good, you would be the first in line at the shop when it opens to get the good. I was trying to dig my brain to think of a good that people actually queue up for, and I thought, well, I did actually see the thing about a month ago or so, maybe, yeah, probably a month ago, maybe less. I saw people queuing up outside the Apple store when iPhone 17 was being released, and I did think to myself, oh wow, you got to be pretty motivated to want a new phone to actually queue up outside the store before opening time so that you will be the first to get the iPhone. There are a lot of other things that people queue up for. I don't actually know the reason for some of the other goods that people queue up for, but at least the iPhone makes sense. There's a new technology that came out. It was really hyped up. The camera was really amazing. I can't remember what else was amazing. But anyhow, so these people really cared about having a new iPhone, and they have a high willingness to pay, and so they got a big surplus out of the transaction to the extent that they were willing to queue up for hours in line to get that good sooner. So the rationing rule is an assumption that makes sense, and we're going to use that rule over and over again. Now, I'm not going to use these particular slides, but I am going to talk about the definition of consumer surplus and producer surplus first before I move on to the slide that I want to talk about. Now, we know from last lecture when we talked about that really messy slide. Where's that really messy slide? Where we talked about the calculation, how we calculated over here on the right-hand side, the consumer surplus and producer surplus. So I physically calculated with you every time we made a decision. Now, let's have a look at a slightly different slide. We say that a consumer surplus represents a difference between what a consumer pays for a good or service and what she or he is willing to pay for that good or service, which is your reservation price. The producer surplus, on the other hand, represents the difference between the price a seller receives for a good or a service and what he is willing to receive for that good or service. So in the example that we were using, the equilibrium price is $3. And at $3, your consumer, your buyer one, was originally willing to pay $6. Now they are happy to take to buy the product at $3. So their consumer surplus is 6 minus 3, which is 3. The producer surplus, on the other hand, seller 1 was originally willing to accept $1, but they're way happy accepting $3. So $3 minus the reservation price of $1 gives you a producer surplus of $1. Now, see how these graphs are sort of like a step. And remember how we talked about these graphs being discrete, and now we're going to move it continuous. We're going to move those graphs, these discrete graphs, and make it continuous in a little bit. Now, before I do that, we also said that at price 3, no one is tempted to change the price of the quantity. And so in a perfectly competitive markets are equilibrium price takers. So we take whatever price that the market has determined. We will actually see that right at the end when we put the individual demand and supply curves side by side with the market demand and supply curve. So that will be very interesting to see. Now, okay, so this is the graph that I want. I'll go back to the definition first. Your total consumer surplus represents the sum of the economic surplus of all the consumers. Your producer surplus is the same. It represents the sum of the economic surplus of all the producers. Now, the total surplus is basically the sum of these two added together. Now, we're going to see this. I really like this graph because I think it sums up very well what we were talking about before. Now, buyer 1 is the keenest to buy. Seller 1 is the keenest to sell. Buyer 1 had a reservation price of $6. So they are willing to pay, the willingness to pay for buyer 1 is $6 or less. Okay? So willingness to pay is less or equal to $6. This is for buyer 1. Now, if the good was priced at $7 or more, then they would say, no, I'm not interested. I'm not buying. I'm out. The actual price of the economy is $3. So therefore, for buyer one, they were willing to pay $6, but they only need to pay $3. $3 is their consumer surplus. Okay, the happiness buyer one is experiencing when they're purchasing the good at $3. So actually, in this particular box here, this box is actually $3. That is their consumer surplus. For producers, seller one was willing to sell at $1, but they are lucky to be pocketing $3 for this good. Okay, so the difference between 3 and 1 is the producer surplus here of 2. Okay, so area A represents the total consumer surplus, and area B represents total producer surplus. Now, the total surplus in this particular instance between buyer 1 and seller 1 is A plus B. Then you can do the same for buyer 2. Buyer 2 has a lower surplus. I mean, we can easily see that because that box is smaller. Okay, smaller than this box. Okay, and the box for the seller is also smaller. Now, let's see what this means. Buyer 2 has a lower surplus than buyer 1. Buyer 2 does not care about obtaining the good as much as buyer 1. Remember I talked about buyer, the keenness to buy, and I talked about people lining up outside the Apple store. Well, I definitely wasn't one of them. And my sister, who loves Apple anything, she also didn't line up to buy the latest iPhone. And so buyer 2 didn't care about obtaining that good that quickly. And therefore, they're going to get a little less surplus. Now, seller 2, on the other hand, the surplus is also a little bit smaller compared to seller 1. The reason for this is because the production capability for seller 2 is not as efficient, and therefore their marginal cost of production is captured by their reservation price. Okay, so can I just write this down? Marginal cost of production is captured by reservation price at $2. Okay. They're a little bit more inefficient. And how are they a little bit more inefficient? They're a little bit more inefficient in the way that they produce. They're not as technologically efficient compared to seller 1. Now let's look at buyer 3. Buyer 3, with regards to the iPhone, would be me. I was quite happy with my iPhone 7 until it completely died on me. So whether I have iPhone 17, I mean, I would love to, but I can't justify it. Like, it really doesn't bother me. Like, the technology, I mean, I use it to surf the net, play some music, use the phone, use the camera. I don't care about the product enough. To me, it's like, blah. And So if I am buyer 3 in this particular scenario, my reservation price is 3. I don't get any surplus out of the transaction. Doesn't bother me. Seller 3 is also not getting a lot of surplus out of the transaction, simply because technologically they were inefficient in the way they were producing. Therefore, the cost was a bit higher for them. $3 was just enough to cover their marginal costs. And so, no surplus. So, for seller 3, surplus equals 0. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, your total surplus is maximized at the equilibrium point, at the equilibrium price. So at $3 here, your total surplus is maximized. And that's really important. Now, let's move away from this jagged discrete model like I was talking to you about. It's like a step ladder coming downwards and going upwards sloping. But it is still a discrete model, like very, very jagged, very, very choppy. I wrote this earlier. Total surplus is maximized exactly at equilibrium price P. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at this graph. This looks at your consumer and producer surplus. We are now at the continuous model. We explained what the difference is between the continuous model and the discrete model in demand. We talked about the discrete model and the continuous model in supply. And now in the aggregate curves, I'm not going to go back and explain because we've done that for demand and supply, and the same logic applies. Now here, this is $3. And at $3, your yellow box, your yellow triangle, shows your total consumer surplus. And at $3, the green box is your total producer surplus. So the entire two triangles put together generates you a bigger triangle, and that will show you your total surplus. Now, I'm going to change the price, okay, and see how consumer surpluses and producer surpluses change. But before I do that, one of the good ways of describing is, and I really do want you to write this down in your exam, this will be really, really helpful. And that is to say, your total consumer surplus is the area below demand curve. So see this line here. Sorry, it's a little bit hard for me to, I'm trying to do it upside down. Area below the demand curve and above the price. So this area below the demand curve and above the price, this entire triangle here in yellow is your total consumer surplus. The producer surplus, on the other hand, is the area above supply curve. So see this supply curve, area above the supply curve, and below the price. So below the price, above the supply curve, that's your producer surplus. Okay, very, very useful way to describe where your consumer and producer surplus is and how to identify them. Okay, we know that total surplus equals total consumer surplus plus total producer surplus. Sorry for the short form, I just didn't want to write it all down. Okay, so that plus that gives you total surplus. Okay, now, is there another price that we can do better and achieve a higher total surplus? Let me see if there's another slide like that. No, I don't want to use that slide. Okay. All right, what I'm going to do is I am going to erase what I've done because I want to use this graph. Did they allow me to erase the whole thing? I said erase entire thing. So annoying. Okay, it only wants to let me erase tiny little bits. Okay. I'm just gonna erase this a little bit, okay? Sorry, it's blinking on the screen. I think it's blinking. No, it's not. Oh, yeah, it is blinking. I do not know why it wouldn't let me erase the entire line because I told it to. Okay, never mind. This is good enough. All right, let's have a look and see if there is another price, not $3. Okay, we're not going to trade at $3. Imagine the market is going to sell at this price. So imagine this is $3. This is P. The market is going up to P1. The market says, well, we're going to increase our price from P to P1. Well, is this going to make society better off? What is our total surplus? Okay, let's have a look. So here, this is our price. And at this point where it hits the demand curve, this is our quantity demanded. Okay, then we take that price and we go to the supply curve. That goes down, and this is our quantity supplied. Okay. Now, clearly, we now have excess supply. How do we know? Because our quantity supply is now greater than quantity demanded. The more suppliers want to supply, but there are less consumers who are willing to purchase at this particular price. So let's have a look at what our consumer surplus is going to look like. Remember my definition. I said the area, what did I say? The area below the demand curve and above the price. So let's see. Our area below the demand curve and above the price. So that orange bit is now my consumer surplus. These consumers have high willingness to pay, but they're still less happy. So they are losing out on their happiness factor. Then we look at this bit here. These people here the willingness for these consumers to pay at that particular triangle are too low, or they don't have enough willingness to pay, and therefore these consumers are not going to consume the good anymore. So these are your lost consumers. They go, sorry, nah, not interested. Okay. So in general, your consumers are worse off because we started off with a really big yellow triangle and now we've shrunk to a tiny orange one. Let's look at what happens with our producers. Okay, we started off with a green triangle that says total producer surplus. At this particular higher price, well, generally, the law of supply says that producers are happy with a higher price. But at this higher price, because of the rationing rule, which is the assumption that we use, we are assuming that producers with the lowest reservation price or the lowest marginal cost, they are going to be the ones that are keenest to go first. And they're the keenest to go first and to produce the good. These producers are actually happy and happier than before because they get more surplus. They are now recovering some of the surplus lost by the consumers. Let's have a look. I'm trying to find a color. Maybe use this funny blue. Okay. So producer surplus is area above the supply curve. So this is your supply curve. We take the area above the supply curve, stops here. And then we go up. And it is below the price. So that's your price. So now, this blue bit is your producer surplus. Okay. Now, even though we have recovered some of the surpluses lost as a producer by, I think I'm going to rephrase my sentence. Even though the producers have recovered some of the surplus lost by the consumers, there is still a small triangle, which is this bit here. these are the producers that were left out. They are producers that are not producing anymore. Why? Because there wasn't enough demand. So all that we're saying is at P1, your total surplus is smaller because we started out with, a big yellow triangle and a big green triangle. Now we have an orange triangle and a blue shape and the purple triangle and the red triangle that they're not surpluses anymore, either producer or consumer. So we are still producing less total surplus, okay, at price P1. So we are going to look at consumer and producer surpluses again in the next chapter. Because when we look at taxation, we're going to go back to, looking at the impact that it has on producer surpluses and consumer surplus. So if you're not too sure still about the concept of producer surplus and consumer surplus, please go back, have a think about it, and come back when we look at the next chapter next week. And if you still don't understand, please let us know. Now, to sum up, a higher price at the market equilibrium price makes certain producers better off, but makes all consumers worse off. Okay, that includes the ones that took up and have the high willingness to consume. A lower price than the market equilibrium price makes certain consumers better off, but makes all the producers worse off. So what we're saying here is at the equilibrium where demand equals supply is where society is at its highest surplus, the highest levels of happiness. It is therefore where total surplus is maximized. Okay? The exciting part of what economists love is that because you don't need a government to determine the outcome of the market, there is no need for a central planning body deciding what to do. Okay? The market itself, which includes the producers and the consumers themselves, they are going to reach a point that has the highest total surplus. Okay? They compete in the market totally by themselves without any government intervention. And next week, we will introduce government intervention, and then we'll talk about what is the impact there with government intervention. Now, economics is all about application to the real world, application to what is happening within our economy, what is happening globally. And so we're going to show you this diagram, okay? And we're going to look at what is happening in the world at the moment and try and apply it to this diagram. Okay, so you can basically take most most global topics that you see in the news and apply it and draw it in a graph and show the impacts that it has on society. Let's have a think. Well, there are a lot of wars going on at the moment. Okay, Ukraine and Russia, Palestine and Israel. Let's look at the war in Ukraine because it's gone on for a little bit longer. Let's look at this diagram and say this is a market for something. Okay? I just mentioned war in Ukraine, or war. The war in Ukraine has created a lot of effects around the world. You know, Europe is affected, you know, all the neighboring countries around the area, they're all having, a negative impact. However, there is a market that might have benefited from this war. And that market is a market for weapons. Okay? You want to go and bomb someone? Well, it will run out, so you need to go and buy some more. So let's say that originally this is demand. It's a brighter pen. This is demand before war. Okay. So the demand and supply curve before the war gives you a point at price P and at price and quantity Q. Okay. So this is demand and supply. This is your equilibrium price and quantity. However, war started, and it doesn't matter what war, it's a few you can choose from. War started. So what happens when war started? When war started, we now have a higher demand for weapons. Okay? And because we have a higher demand for weapons, the demand curve therefore shifts to the right, because now there's a higher demand. It's not because of price. It's because the countries who are fighting each other now need more weapons. And as a result of that, this shift will mean more supply of weapons. So we go to this point. This is the new quantity that we need now, and at a new price. Now, the price increase is because the number of producers for weapons, the supply in the short run supply is fixed. We can't really change. Let's say you've got, you have a country where there are a lot of, toy factories, people making perfumes and people making furniture. Well, they can't just suddenly change their business model or their manufacturing model and start manufacturing weapons, even though there is an increase in demand and we now need more weapons. So because supply isn't changing, your pressure, there will be an upward pressure on price. Okay, upward pressure. And what this upward pressure indicates is that your weapons will now be more expensive. So the price is not P times Q, it's now P1 times Q1. Now, I'm going to use the same curve. I know that you have other diagrams. I'm going to leave those diagrams clean. I want to use the same diagram because I want you to see the impact. Now let's say we talked about before the war market equilibrium. I'm going to label this so that when we are describing it, you understand. So before the war, market equilibrium is at point A. After the war, in the short run, market equilibrium is at point B. Because demand for weapons increase, putting an upward pressure on price in the short run, it moves from P to P1 and moves from Q to Q1. But now, let's think. In the long run, factories can actually repurpose. They can reinvent themselves and go, well, what we're selling, what we're making here isn't going to make us very much money. There's a lot of demand for weapons. Is it possible for us to move towards weapon manufacturing? So there'll be factories that are repurposed into manufacturing weapons. So we then move our supply curve. Now, let's say supply curve moves to the right. Okay. It moves a little bit to the right. We have more suppliers now for weapons. Now, we talk about price change. Okay. Now, with price change, when we shift our supply curve to S1, because we only shifted a little bit, our new equilibrium is at point C. Okay, which means that our new equilibrium price is at P2. Right? And we are going to produce a little bit more at Q2. Okay, we're at point C now, our equilibrium price. So it dropped, price decreased. It decreased a little bit. It's still above your initial price, but its quantity has increased. Okay, because we now have more suppliers. So we're supplying more. But in order to tell you how much price would change realistically, I need to be given the information as to how much supply has shifted. Because here my assumption is supply shifted a little bit. Who knows? Maybe the market is so attractive and you make so much money selling to countries that are fighting a war, countries that are just stocking up. They're not at war, but they're just stocking up. And so suddenly, supply didn't shift a little bit to the right. Let's say hypothetically, supply shift this much to the right. Let's say it didn't shift a little bit, it shifted this much. What happened there? This is in the long run, because in the long run, you know, there are a lot of movements. People can repurpose, people can come into the market, do all sorts of things because there's chaos in the world at the moment. So look at our price. Now, this I don't want to change this to point D because I don't actually know whether my supply curve shifts to the point C at equilibrium or C dot dot. I don't know. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they need to tell you. They need to give you the information of how much it has shifted. Because in this particular case, see how our price decreased from B to C, from B to C. This is a large decrease in price. It actually goes down below your initial price where equilibrium is at point A. Does that make sense? I'm really hoping that this is clear. Okay. A lot of downward pressure is being placed if the supply curve shifts a lot to the right. Okie dokes. Let's have a quick look. Thank you so much again, Trent. You are super amazing. Thank you for answering all the questions. Now, we're going to move on to the last, not the last concept, the second last concept for today. Now, we are going to spend the next half an hour talking, well, a little bit less than half an hour, talking about two concepts. We're going to talk firstly about Pareto efficiency. Sorry, been talking nonstop. Now, Pareto is an Italian economist, and his theory was so on efficiency. His definition of efficiency was so amazing that they named this after him. So we call it the Pareto efficiency definition of Pareto's definition of efficiency. Now, Pareto efficiency states that a situation in which it is impossible to make any individual better off without making at least one other individual worse off. Now, I was talking about Pareto efficiency at home, and my kids tell me, "Oh, Mom, that's a really terrible example." And they wanted a food efficiency. So I'm going to give you two examples, and take whichever makes more sense to you. Now, imagine I have a pizza. I cut that pizza into 8 slices. And I have 2 children. And I gave my 10-year-old, who's growing, he's very active, so I gave him 6 slices. And I gave my daughter 4 slices. Okay, because she is 4 years younger. She, doesn't move around as much as he does. And so I thought, okay, I'll give 6 to one child and 4 to the other. Now, if I then want to create some form of equality, okay, and look at efficiency, I can't then take 1 slice from my son and give that 1 slice to my daughter and create 5 and 5. That is not Pareto efficiency because, that's not Pareto efficient because my son will make my son 1 slice worse off whilst I make my daughter 1 slice better off. Okay. Now, another example that you could use is something that we've been talking about since the start of this, the start of me taking over lecturing of the course. We talk about the recaps. I gather that some students really love the recaps and some students don't really like the recaps because they think, oh, well, I have a mind like a sieve. I can, I can remember everything. Okay, you know what I said before. I can remember everything. I have photographic memory. I really don't need you to repeat yourself a million times for me to remember. And then I have all these other students that gave me feedback that said, "Oh, I really love it. Can you make it longer?" And so what happens here is if I have people who love the recap and others who don't like the recap, then if I make it shorter, I will make some people happy, but I will make others unhappy. Okay? I try to make changes, but Pareto will tell me that I am being inefficient. Now, going back to the market, the perfectly competitive market that we were talking about. A perfectly competitive market's equilibrium is Pareto efficient. Quantity demand equals quantity supply. There's no tendency to change. There's no incentive to change because your total surplus is maximized. If I change this in any way, I will make someone better off and someone worse off. Remember that graph that I showed you earlier? This was Pareto efficient at $3. But when we changed the price to P1, some consumers are worse off and some consumers or some producers are better off. But some consumers, we've lost some consumers and we've lost some producers. And so this is at P1, it is not Pareto efficient. To state it in a different way, P1 cannot be a Pareto efficient point. Okay? And that is really important. Let's go back. Okay? I repeat this one last time. Pareto efficiency is a situation in which it is impossible to make any individual better off without making at least one other individual worse off. We're not talking about whole group. Even if it affects one person, you're not Pareto efficient. Now, I just mentioned this. A perfectly competitive market equilibrium is Pareto efficient. And I also mentioned that total surplus is maximized at that point. Now, the next point that is stated there states that there's no Pareto improving transaction, which means that no possible transaction that will make someone better off without harming someone else. Now, the next slide should show you the definition of Pareto improving transaction, which is exactly what we said earlier, that a transaction where all parties involved are better off. I'll give you an example. Let's say every single one of you, every single person in the entire Econ 1101 cohort loves long recaps. Loves. And when I do 15-minute recaps, everybody goes, Esther, can you do 30-minute recaps? Please. And I go, okay, you like a longer recap, I'll give you a longer recap. So I gave you a longer recap. This is classified as a Pareto improving transaction because now every single one of you, not even one, every single one of you is completely happy. Okay? So I am satisfying everybody. And that is classified as a Pareto improving transaction. Now, as we talk about Pareto efficiency, Pareto is only interested about the concept of efficiency. It's designed to be a concept about efficiency. It is completely oblivious to anything to do with equality or opportunity. Now, let's give you an example. Let's imagine that this economy that you are in is a two-person economy. Okay? Person one has $100 million. Person two has $100. Okay? Clearly not fair, right? But this situation is Pareto efficient if there's no way to make either person better off without making the other person worse off. Now, if I take money from person one who has 100 million and I give it to person two, so that person one now has $50 million and $50, and person two also has $50 million and $50. Even though now we have achieved equality between the two people in the economy, and 50 million is a lot of money. Like, you know, why would the person with 100 million be pissed off in an economy of just two people that he has 50 million? Still a lot of money. However, that's not the point. The point is that transferring money from person one to person two will make person one unhappy, even though it'll make person two very, 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 very happy. This is not a Pareto improving transaction. This is more equal, but not a Pareto improvement, because person one is worse off. I'm really hoping that you understand this. Pareto efficiency is only focused on the concept of efficiency. It doesn't mention anything about equality of resources or opportunity. This is what the government has to do. According to economists, the government should allow the market to be as efficient as it can be, and then it is the government's job to redistribute. Okay? And equality within a society is also really, really important. Okay? Which is why next week we will start talking about government intervention, because one of the key things is that government should let the market do what it does best and be efficient, and then do their little job to redistribute. Now, what is wrong with the world at the moment? If you look at the world, there are a lot of problems in the world today. And economists believe that a lot of it is because inequality is growing. The rich is getting richer and the poor is getting poorer. Inflation doesn't help, because if you look at percentage of price increase for the rich, peanuts, but the percentage price increase of, essential goods has a big impact on the poor, and they then get poorer as a result of that, without anything else changing. And the government at the moment doesn't seem to be able, or they might be not willing, they might be unable to redistribute. And so what we're saying is there are big winners and big losers from globalization and from markets. The losers are getting more and more upset, and you can see that in the elections because the governments aren't doing they believe that the governments aren't doing enough to help. And of course, winners will always be winners. They're always happy. Now, so it is very important for society to understand how to be both efficient and also able to redistribute. On the area of redistribution, we're definitely failing as a society because we know as economists that equal societies are really, really powerful, and they can express a harmonious, democratic voice. A society with huge inequality has a lot of problems. They can be very, very problematic. So that's really something that we want to talk about as we're looking at Pareto efficiency. Okay, last one. We'll finish it off. I'm only going to start on this. I'll talk about most of the slides, and then what I want to do is I'll use the invisible hand as the starting point for the recap, bringing us into government intervention. So the invisible hand theory states, and I'll read this from the definition first. The invisible hand principle states that the individual's independent efforts to maximize their gains, so profits for sellers, happiness for buyers, will generally be beneficial for society and result in socially optimal allocation of resources. Let's explain what this means. This means that economists are in love with markets because markets by themselves are efficient without the need for government intervention. They reach a price and quantity that maximizes total surplus. It maximizes the social happiness. If we have a pie of happiness, it maximizes the social pie of happiness that we have. And it is also the point where it is Pareto efficient. Markets are also very inefficient in one other way. And this is the concept of the invisible hand. The invisible hand I just mentioned states that individuals' independent efforts to maximize their gains will generally be beneficial for society and result in the socially optimal allocation of resources. What that means is we let people do whatever is in their best interest for themselves. Let's have a look at a diagram. We love drawing this diagram. We got price and we got quantity, we got demand, we got supply. And we let the producers and the consumers do what is best for themselves. They will selfishly do what is best. And the result of this self-interest is the equilibrium at P and equilibrium quantity at Q. And that maximizes your total surplus within the society. The invisible hand is the core of economics. And it works very, very well. If, there's a very big if that I'm going to use here, if the market is perfectly competitive. Okay? If the invisible hand is the core of economics and works very well if the market is perfectly competitive. Now, after you come back from your flex week, we're going to talk about imperfect markets like oligopolies and monopolies. This is not going to work. Okay? If the market is not perfectly competitive, this theory will not work. Now, there's more to it. Now, we talk about a long-run technological efficiency that is a result of this invisible hand. Now, let me see if I have a diagram that I can utilize. I don't want this. I am going to hopefully squeeze it into here. Okay, now I am going to draw I'm going to do one part and then I'm going to join the other and then I'll go back. So I'm doing part B first before I do part A, which is a little bit weird, but bear with me for the moment. Now, I am going to start with a marginal cost curve. And I'm going to tell you that your marginal cost curve is how will dictate how much you need to pay for each additional quantity of the good. Marginal cost for each additional unit. Number two, I'm going to show you the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price here, let's say hypothetical, is at P star. Now at P, we know that our price is our marginal benefit. So what that means is when this price hits this point, marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And also, price equals marginal benefit. Oh, sorry. Price equals marginal cost. Sorry. P equals MC. Okay, because that's where P touches MC. So we are going to then include another curve. We're going to include, now I've got to be very careful here when I draw this. Imagine this is your minimum ATC. That's your minimum ATC. So it will cut your minimum ATC. And what happens is I'm going to take this point and I'm going to put it down. And this is where I'm going to produce at this quantity and at this price. And where it intersects your marginal, your ATC at this point. This is not a very good graph. Never mind. I'm happy with that. That's all right. This is your profit. Okay, but this is your individual firm's demand curve. And what happens is we know that this price, because we are price takers, this price is actually determined by the market. We didn't determine that. The market determined that. So we're going to take that price. And we're going to go, okay, demand, supply, and this is the market. Okay, the market will determine the price, and that price will be set. But that at the moment, that's not the price. Eventually, next on Tuesday, I will actually show you that what happens with having a profit. Because when you have a profit, your suppliers will enter the market. And when your suppliers enter the market, they will shift your supply curve to the right. And what that does is it pushes your price down. Okay? Because remember, one of the key characteristics of a competitive market is that there are many buyers and sellers. There are no barriers to entry, so there's easy entry and exit from the marketplace. And as a result of that, we also talked about, you know, resources that are very mobile. And as a result of that, we are able to increase our supply. Supplies will very quickly increase because there are no barriers, and it will shift your supply curve to the right. And so that supply curve to the right would then give you a new equilibrium point, and that equilibrium point gives you that price for your individual firm. Okay. Now, I want to finish here only because I did the same with the the live lecture this morning, and so I would like to finish here. I will continue from here and then move on to, I will do the recap of Pareto efficiency and invisible hand at the beginning of the next lecture, and I will finish off very quickly this topic or the remainder of this topic, and then I'll move on to government intervention. Now, if you have any questions, oh my God, Trent, you are amazing. You've been answering all these questions. If you have any questions for me, let me know. But I'll like to stop here. It's a logical place to stop, and we will take it forward on Tuesday. All right, everyone. Well, tomorrow is the last day of the working week, so I hope you all have a great weekend ahead or a great rest of the week. There's 1.5 days left. I really appreciate all of you. I've been looking at how many people have viewed the content, and that was really amazing. I've been trying to play economics myself so that I understand what you guys have to do. So that is a really amazing to see how well you guys have been doing. So keep it up, keep asking the questions, and we are all just one email away. So please feel free to send Alberto or myself an email if you have any questions. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for today. I will hang around a little bit longer just to make sure that you guys don't have any questions popping up, but the chat seems to have stopped, so that is a good sign. All right, guys, I will see you all on Tuesday. Bye, guys. Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Vanisha.
How are you? You've got this room.
Yes.
What time are you finishing? You've got until 2?
Sorry, I just end stream. Just give me 1 second.
So I can check. I don't have my glasses.
Okay. I have it till 1.
Till 1. Okay,
Yeah.
that means I can come in now.
Yeah. Come on in. I just end.